Ryan, would you like to read a poem to get us started today?
That would be great. The poem I'm going to read is called The Old Holler. It was originally published in Three Penny Review almost 10 years ago and was selected by Poetry Daily as one of the daily poems. And the poem is actually about my uncle, even though the poem doesn't say that. But my uncle, once he had to quit farming, he was a cattle hauler. So essentially, this is a poem about him. The Old Holler. He limps into the barn with intentions among suggestions. He leans on his cane in the same angle the earth tilts, and it's a lesson in resignation. He lets us know if someone has sold out and the price of milk next month. We send our bull calves in on Thursdays because the old holler tells us to. He rubs the neck of the cattle that look out his trailer. He once farmed, but the farm is gone. He still gets up at 4 because something tells him to. His shirt sleeves fold neatly over the scars beneath them. He closes the lash behind the wide-eyed calf. Once it's in your blood, he says, you can't get it out. The old holler asks what we're putting in the tank and if we got our corn in with the weather. Every time he leaves, I understand our communion better. How come he rests on the gate so heavily, and why he speaks to the bulls he takes to slaughter.
That's Ryan Dennis reading what I call a golden poem about, as he was saying, a relative of his, but more generally about the farm and farming existence. It is also a poem that is featured prominently on Ryan's website called The Milk House. I am so pleased to have Ryan Dennis here visiting for a few minutes with us on the Poetry Ex Hunger website blogs post. Ryan, let me introduce Ryan to you. He's got a remarkable background. Ryan Dennis explores the dynamics of rural life and those who inhabit it. He's a fiction writer, he's written personal essays, and as you've just heard, he's written wonderful poetry. And his work has appeared in many, many literary journals, such as the Cimarron Review, Fourth Genre, the New England Review, and many, many others. He's a former Fulbright recipient in creative writing and has taught widely at several different universities. He's the author of the literary farming novel called The Beast They Turned Away. He lives in Ireland, and it's just a real pleasure to have you here with us today, Ryan. Is there anything that I left out of the introduction that you would want to make sure people are aware of about you?
That was a pretty kind introduction, and thanks for having me again, Hiram. This year, I'm also a writer in residence at Maynooth University. And I suppose I just mentioned that because part of my project there, related but separate to the Milk House, is to try to showcase the work of farmers themselves and Irish farmers, and them writing about farming, their experience with it, what it has become. And so that's one of my side projects this
Very
year.
cool. And Maynooth is in Ireland. Maynooth University is in Ireland. For those of us in the US who may not be familiar, that's correct?
That's true. Yep, about a half hour east of Dublin on the
Great.
western part of the island.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'd like, if you could, to just spend, speaking of the Milk House work, tell us a little bit about the Milk House. What were you thinking about as you developed the plans for it, its intent, its goals? I just personally think it's just a wonderful opportunity to celebrate the rural voice. But tell us a little bit about your thinking as you developed the Milk House.
The conception of the Milk House actually came out of my experience trying to publish my novel. And when I sent it to agents and publishers, I was nearly shocked at the response, most of which was, we like the work, we think it's innovative, but and because of its style, I don't want to say it's experimental, but there's non-conventional storytelling techniques in it, and a lot of specific farming stuff. It's about farming, so they felt that the type of people who usually read about farming will be put off by avant-garde style. It's not avant-garde, but it's something non-conventional. Whereas they thought those who usually read avant-garde literature will be put off by all the specific details of farming, which is something I disagreed with.
Thank goodness.
yeah, and so I thought there must be other writers out there who are kind of experiencing this resistance, that when they write about the rural experience and do so in a way that is not sort of traditional or pastoral, or perhaps kind of the comment down on the farm memoir, which there's nothing wrong with, of course, but you know, when if there must be writers trying to do something more or different than that.
Sure.
And so I wanted to create a space for them to get exposure, to showcase the work, and to find readers looking for that type of writing as well. And in doing so, I hoped the Milk House would be a space in which there could be perhaps more complex discourse of what it means to be from or connected to a rural environment, and more than, you know, it's just a green space to escape from the city.
Sure.
And to suggest that, you know, perhaps some of the best and groundbreaking and innovative writing doesn't just come from metropolitan areas,
from the urban, right?
But also from rural spaces as well.
Well, thank goodness that you perceived that gap and stepped in to address it. How long have you had the Milk House up and running?
The Milk House, as it is now, will turn 3 years old next month.
Okay.
I've written a syndicated column for agricultural journals called The Milk House for over 10 years now, but the Milk House as a rural writing collective, as I called it, and a space for writers and readers to get together on the rural subject, will turn 3 sometime in March.
Well, that's been long enough. I'm just curious, what sort of reactions have you gotten to the Milk House and the terrific postings that you've offered there from the rural community, from the writers about writers who are writing about the rural community? What sort of reactions have you gotten?
It was quite humbling, and I know maybe that's kind of a common and expected thing to say in these sort of ventures, but I was surprised at how much support it did receive. There were several online news sources in Ireland that picked it up and spread the word about it. Other writers were very supportive, and not just mentioning they were glad there was this opportunity for just rural writing, but also there was a lot of quite accomplished writers that helped get the project off the ground in the beginning by allowing me to share some of their work. Like Will Weaver in the US, among other things, writes a lot of fiction based on the farm experience. And Ireland, there's Patrick Deely, a fantastic poet who's been very supportive in sharing his work and telling others about it. And so it has been very encouraging to see the response to it, and probably more so than I even expected.
That's wonderful. Yeah, you have a map on the website showing where the writers who have contributed to the Milk House are located, and you kind of have a worldwide span. I'm sure you're always looking for more writers from different spots, but you have folks from Africa, from, of course, Europe, Ireland, and other places in Europe, and then in the US as well. So you've drawn on a fairly large community already, and I'm sure you're ever expanding that community.
Yeah, yeah. And I hope by having a global reach for the Milk House and a global kind of a blanket audience for it, and that I hope it adds to the discussion of what ways are rural experiences unique among different places of the globe, you know,
Sure.
and also what are some of the common aspects that you know, someone from the countryside in Pennsylvania might have with you know, someone in Wales, for example.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
so I hope there's by encouraging a global reach for the project, I hope there's that type of dialogue going on, which I kind of find in agricultural journals, maybe particularly in the US, you know, where I was born as well, but also places, there doesn't seem to be an outlooking perspective of farming and rural people in different places. So there's another gap I hope the Milk House filled, is that it would satisfy or encourage the curiosities of readers who might be from the US, who wonder what it's like to
Sure.
you know, be from the countryside in New Zealand or Ireland or
Sure.
other places.
I know when I was working at U.S. Department of Agriculture, we helped sponsor programs called farmer to farmer programs. And that allowed farmers from the US to travel overseas. And not to put too fine of a point on it, but I believe that it's honest to say that many of the farmers who participated traveled overseas, and often to developing countries, poorer countries, with the thought that they were taking in their bags and in their minds all sorts of tools and capabilities and approaches that would be useful. In other words, they were sharing their expertise with colleagues overseas. And typically, upon debrief on their return, they would exclaim about how much they learned and how much was shared in the experience of farming as they settled in Zimbabwe or in Thailand. It was a shock and surprise to them that there was as much for them to learn from their counterparts as they had to impart to their counterparts, so to speak. So the work that you're doing, particularly with the writing community, I think is just so important to demonstrate that we have a lot to learn from one another. Well, tell me, based on the times that you've been involved, it sounds like you've been in this kind of area of work for many years, with the Milk House as a kind of a web-sited effort for the last 3 years. What has surprised you about being involved in leading this work, and what's been the kind of the primary challenge to the work?
I suppose in some ways the answer for me might be the same, in that I probably should have anticipated how much is at stake when you are given someone's work that they trust with you. Um, and there was something this is something I had to learn, I think. And you know, what's at stake for you in providing this platform for the work. So making sure that their work is presented properly, make sure they get as best exposure as you could. And of course, I try to support the authors afterwards as well, if they publish other work, and, you know, share their accomplishments the best they can. And so fairly quickly on, I was given original work from fairly esteemed writers. So, and it turned out great. One of those pieces was nominated for the best short story in Ireland as well. I was longlisted anyway. So I was surprised that people would trust me already with such high quality work.
That's wonderful.
And so to me, it just raised the idea that, okay, there's something at stake here, and I have to rise to that trust as well, to make sure that I and the Milk House do the best we can to support these authors. And
Well, the one word that comes to my mind as I view the website is respect. You are you and Tima Greiser, who is the editor of the site, very respectful of the work. You present it not in a holy way or sacred way, but you do present it very, very carefully, well curated, and in ways that the reader, I think, can go in, the viewer can go in and really appreciate. So I'm sure that the writers, esteemed and otherwise, are very grateful for that platform that you prepared. Has working with the Milk House affected your own writing in any way?
I would say, particularly on the project I'm working with now, I'm working on a nonfiction book, mostly memoir based, that tries to, at minimum, show the experience of one family farm, ours, going through the structural changes in agriculture, farms having to get bigger, bigger to survive, and then what happens when you can't or are not willing to do that. And I think the experience of the Milk House reinforced that there are other people, individuals, families with a similar story, and that it's important to tell this story, that you know, it's not just my story I'm telling, but to some extent it's their story as well. And when I see submissions coming in from the Milk House and people sharing their work and their life experiences, again, it just emphasizes, okay, this is something that I need to get right, not just for myself or for my career, but for the sake of this agricultural community out there that some of which, or many of which, has found themselves in ways disfranchised.
You really tapped into a need, an unmet need, Ryan, I think, and it sounds like are having all of the terrific experiences around having being that tapper of need. You really have identified a whole area of work that needs, and a voice, basically, voices that need to be given a spot. Let's begin to close down here by kind of focusing in just a little bit. As you know, I've done some work on poetry of hunger, and the Poetry X Hunger website is all about poets speaking back to hunger. So I'm just curious, in your work, have you found that there are writers out there who are talking about or writing about farming, about agriculture, about how agriculture is done, and the impacts of that, i.e. food security or food insecurity or hunger? What are you finding there in terms of that community and what it's saying about those key issues, especially anything kind of hunger related?
We, team and I, have been lucky to publish certain writers on the Milk House that have directly talked about this change of farming, and by that I mean, you know, this expansion of farming. And one I mentioned was Will Weaver, who particularly some of his short stories are about farmers who have had to sell out because you know, and what they're going through. Another is Richard Levins. He was a colleague at the University of Minnesota of Willard Cochrane, who and maybe you know yourself, Hiram, working the USDA, was economist in the 50s, eventually under JFK, and as Dr. Levins put it, might have been one of the last major fights to save family farming in the US. And he's the one that Cochrane was the one that coined the term productivist treadmill that is still used in agricultural economics when talking about you know, the type of farming. And then we also had submissions from farmers themselves who've talked about food production and the consequences of maybe more market-based pricing that encourages, or specific policies that encourages cheaper food, but then as a consequence, lower farm gate pricing.
Yes.
And I think that speaks in talking about change of farming, in some ways speaks quite directly to part of the initiative of Poetry Ex Hunger, which I think is a fantastic initiative, and I'll tell you why in a second. But I noticed once I left the U.S., I lived a couple years in Iceland, writing about their farmers, a couple years in Germany, and then now in Ireland for 8 years. And once I've been away for a while and came back to the rural area in upstate New York, where I'm from, I suddenly realized how impoverished the area was. I think rural areas in many countries are experiencing challenges of depopulation, losing services, not having access to anymore to banks nearby, to police station, all these things. But in the US, at least particularly in my area, and I think other places, it's even more pronounced. And I know as our area lost other small farmers and they consolidate just to a few big farms, the community essentially died. All the business left the town nearest to me. That's 500 people. The school's about to close. The bank left a few years ago. And so these communities are more impoverished because of this change in agriculture that some of these writers are addressing. And I think the work that what's so great about Poetry Ex Hunger, the initiative, is the value of telling this story and addressing this issue. I've argued in a few different venues in writing that part of the loss of small farming and family farming is a loss of narrative. So in some ways that is the stories attached to the land that family farms have, their memories of it, and the way those memories affect the way they treat the land, of course. That's gone when big farms take over large areas. And maybe the way both the US and Ireland, their national myth was built on the family farm. At the time, neither Ireland or US had the metropolitan areas of Paris or London. So the founding fathers said, all right, farmers are who we are, and that's how we're defining ourselves. So we're losing that, and the face of what we want our food production to be. But also, I think there's tangible consequences of less people writing about farming. So there are less writers, I can at least speak for US and Ireland, less novels published about farming or with farms are set in them. And so I think the work of poets and other writers, and that Poetry Against Hunger emphasizes, is that it is essential to keep telling the story and to keep this in the dialogue, in the discussion, for social capital, for reasons of eventually political capital, and to make sure that this type of narrative is still being fought for and exists. So I'm very excited about what Poetry Ex Hunger does.
That's a really powerful description of kind of the state of affairs. I as you were just saying a second ago, my sense is that lost voice, or the voice that is being lost, also has a lot of ramifications, impacts in not only the community, but even more broadly, the political arena that we're living through these days. It's a terribly paradoxical and just terrible fact that the large majority of those who are hungry in the worldwide, are farmers. What gives about that? I mean, how does that happen? So yes, the farm community, both in terms of its the changes, the difficult changes in it, and then the implications of those changes to all of us. Really important that you are there to help document and raise up and make people aware of the value of that kind of living circumstances, community, and effort, the agricultural, the farming, the rural effort. As we close, is there anything else that you'd like to mention that's on your mind these days, Ryan, as I say, before we close down shop today?
Well, I might have already said it, I guess. I just respect how much I respect the work like the Poetry Against Hunger is doing as far as telling the story, because you know, part of my PhD thesis a few years back was looking for work like this that has this type of goal of keeping this narrative live and making sure it doesn't leave the public consciousness as well, and also kind of bridging the gap between a public goodwill and finding ways that, you know, people could still act like that. Like I was excited to see on the Poetry X Hunger website that there were calls to action on it.
Yes.
And there are ways to do something to make a difference. So I'm excited to see the way that literature can bridge that gap from goodwill to making a difference. So
yeah,
we're
really trying to be intentional about both rousing poets to write about hunger, and they have definitely stepped up and are continuing to, but not just having the poems and sit on the pretty shelf shining there, but actually have them used by anti-hunger advocates, leaders, organizations. They've even been used in houses of worship and libraries, and have led to things like food drives. We've had the very first, in the last couple of years, the very first that I know of, poet in residence opportunities at food banks, where poets go in, learn about food banks, why they're needed, and how they operate, and then write about it. And those poems that have been written have been used in both video and text forms by the organizations to help them strengthen their messages. Because my contention is this kind of writing, the writing that you're helping to enable, and the writing through Poetry X Hunger, we need all the data, all the statistics, all the trend lines. We need all of that. We need all the science. We need all of that to address these kind of concerns. But we also need tools in the toolkit that reach hearts and grab minds and activate people to take action. And I've seen how poems can do that. So all that to say, as we can, Ryan, I hope that we can promise and threaten one another that we will crosswalk our efforts. If you see a poem coming through your window and choose to post it, then I'd love to cross-link it from Poetry X Hunger. And this tape, this video, will be posted on Poetry X Hunger as a way of making sure our audience knows more about the Milk House. Yeah, absolutely, and the good work there. Well, I do thank you for taking the time from Ireland today to visit with us, and best of luck in all of the very, very good work that you're doing, my friend.
Well, thanks. It was my honor, and I was glad to have this conversation with you.
I should also mention I posted the Milk House, just the title of it, in the chat. When we post the video, I'll make sure that the intro paragraph has the website so that people have an easy way of finding it. So thanks again, Ryan.
All right, thanks, Hiram.
All right, take care.
We'll do.